Before the Fast and the Furious and before widespread CGI abuse, there was The Wraith. The Wraith's a 1986 action horror film from director Mike Marvin. The movie opens in a way that was later ripped off by car companies everywhere. A bunch of the little alien probes from Close Encounters fly around and merge into the most awesome car ever. A couple is driving through the desert when they're stopped by a gang of road pirates. The leader of the gang, Packard, informs the couple that they have something he wants.
Why'd you stop me? What do you want?
Well, let's just say it's pink.
Oh no, not my precious Hello Kitty collection! Packard holds George's girlfriend hostage so he can race.
The first one, the Dragonfire Crossing wins! You lose the race! You lose your car!
The two race, and since Packard's losing, he runs George off the road to win. Since he lost the race, he has to give Packard's gang the pink slip to his car.
Hey guys, she's all ours, nice and legal.
I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure he could go to the police and at least have this investigated.
I would have won. You had to cheat to beat me.
He seems genuinely surprised by the fact that a guy who would kidnap his girl and force him to race would also be a cheater. We then go to Jake, the new guy in town. He drives past Carrie's house, and is she wearing a shirt like a dress? Anyway, Jake is asking for directions, and Carrie offers to take him there personally. Hey, I just met you, and this is crazy, but there's my stalker. He's a killer, maybe. Packard shows up and Carrie tells Jake she has to go with him. Over at the local swimming hole, the 80s are in full effect. Billy befriends Jake, so he notices he's covered in scars but doesn't ask him about it. Billy mentions how Carrie used to date his brother Jamie. Jamie was murdered, but nobody knows who did it. Packard has a flashback, and we see him and his gang totally did it. Packard goes to tell Skank and Gutter Boy to keep an eye on Jake. Billy and Carrie both work at Big K's Burger. He goes to give her a lift home, but he's stopped by Packard's gang. Packard's trying to take Billy's car, but then the car from the beginning shows up looking to race.
I'll see you later, huh, faggot?
A lot of balls saying that, considering he's the one wearing the belly shirt. Augie's set to race the Wraith. Real badass tough guy, he has to wear a helmet to race.
Stay on your side of the road, man.
The Wraith easily beats Augie and parks in front of him, causing him to crash. The car reforms and drives off. The police show up at the scene of the accident.
You think he made it?
Yeah, I'm sure he's fine. Sheriff Loomis shows up to interrogate the gang. The paramedics go to show Loomis the body.
Oh, that's ugly, God.
Even though Augie was in a flaming car, his body is fine, except for the fact that his eyes look like they've been burned out. Packard shows Carrie just how obsessed he is with her. He certainly knows how to talk to ladies.
You and me. We're like blood brothers.
What girl wouldn't want to be compared to a blood brother? In Packard's chop shop, the Wraith shows up.
Buddy, I'd put that kidney buster down if I was you.
I'm not your buddy, guy!
His visor opens for just a second, and the appropriately named Rughead has a flashback that shows that the Wraith is really Jamie. The Wraith then proceeds to shoot up the joint. Loomis goes to the airplane graveyard to interrogate old Gutterface and Chickenhead. If this movie was made in the 90s, Gutter Boy would have totally been played by Giovanni Ribisi.
But we know our constitutional rights, sir, and you can't just come in here and... Oh, wow!
He then heads to Big K's for some lunch. As much as I love the 80s, I'm glad the female jean jumpsuit isn't making a comeback. Packard gets a message to race and they all head out. Rughead has something to put on the Wraith's engine, although his engine is from the future. Mr. Fusion's got nothing on this. The cops show up and the two cars take off. Shouldn't one of the cops stay behind and arrest the remainder of the guys involved in the illegal street race? I'm not really a car guy, but isn't the whole point of a supercharger to get more air into the engine? Then why exactly are the flaps closed? The Wraith claims his next victim. I know it's not the same car, but I can't help but think of this. The police try to stop the Wraith, but they are no match. He blows through their roadblock and disappears. Carrie's done work and Jake gives her a lift home. Skank and Gutter Boy see them, so they chase after him, and oh god, I can't stand these guys. Gutter Boy shoots out the steering because he's an idiot, and they crash. Packard sees Jake drop off Carrie. He goes after him, but Jake vanishes into space. The Wraith crashes into the back of his car, pushing him into a graveyard. Yeah, I don't care how tough you are, seeing a gravestone with your name on it would freak out just about anyone. The next day, Jake and Carrie go on a date. Well, isn't she friendly? If Carrie's making out with Jake, then who's this guy? Jake's dropping Carrie off.
You know, today was the nicest day I've had in a long time.
Well, considering the last guy you had sex with was brutally murdered in front of you, I can't imagine having lots of good times after that. The Wraith drives into a garage and kills Skank and Gutter Boy. Thankfully. Packard goes to take Carrie. Billy stands up to him and gets his ass kicked. Well, actually his balls kicked. It's hard to be intimidated by a guy who trots to his car.
So where are we going?
Somewhere no one will ever find us.
The Islanders' trophy room? Carrie finally figures out that Packard killed Jamie. Even though in the flashback she looks right at him, she's just figuring this out now. Packard drops off Carrie so he can race the Wraith. Oh, thanks so much for dropping me off in the middle of the desert. He's exceeding speeds of 55 miles an hour. Packard loses, of course, and dies. Wait a minute, is that a fire-nado? I gotta call sci-fi. I got a good feeling about this. Loomis finds Packard's body.
Just like all the others.
Well, except for the fact that he still has his eyes. The Wraith reveals himself to Carrie.
Jake.
You know who I am.
Jamie.
Jake then goes to see his brother and gives him the car. Jake comes back to pick up Carrie and they drive off together. The movie was shot in 27 days in Tucson, Arizona for about $2.7 million. Even though the movie was supposed to take place during the summer, there were still times where you could clearly see the actor's breath. This was because in reality they were shooting in January and February and just making it look like summer. The scene where Jake is dropping Carrie off, it was actually snowing, and they had to put a tent up around the porch to keep it from getting into the shot. But the worst part for the actors was the lake sequences. It was just above freezing, and they were laying around for hours in bathing suits. Even worse was when Jake and Carrie had to float out onto the water in rafts.
It's a nice day, huh?
This water's a bit chilly for my taste.
For the sex scene, they had lined the rocks with plastic and hooked up machines to heat the water. It took 3 days and still the water was cold, so they had plenty of towels around to keep the actors from freezing. The intro sequence was fully animated by Alan Monroe, who was one of the conceptual artists of the original Predator. The engine sequence was fully animated, however it was incredibly expensive, which is why the effect was so short. Big K's Drive-In was actually a beauty shop they converted to look like a burger joint. The interiors for the gang headquarters was filmed in a warehouse in downtown Tucson. The exteriors were just 3 flat mock-ups. The cars inside were just bodies on frames, so they weren't terribly expensive to destroy. Buddy Joe Hooker was the stunt coordinator, and with movies like Hooper, King of the Mountain, and Moving Violation, this guy knew how to make some great action sequences with cars. One of the stuntmen was David R. Ellis, who went on to direct a personal favorite movie of mine, Snakes on a Plane. Unfortunately, Ellis died earlier this year. The famous car in the film was a 1982 Dodge PPG M4S Turbo Interceptor. There was only one in existence, and it was the pace car for the Indy 500. It cost $1.5 million to make. Even the paint job was $40,000. They were loaned the car, but due to the cost, they couldn't get anyone to insure it, so they never drove it. Instead, they created replicas to use in the film. They cast the body from the original molds and made 6 of them. 2 to drive and 4 to destroy. The ones to drive were built on a Volkswagen chassis and cost about $25,000 each. They were apparently very difficult to drive. The original car is in the movie, but you only see it in the beauty shots. Part of the deal made to get the car in the film was that the Dodge label had to be heavily showcased at one point. Unfortunately, they did it right at the climax of the film, much against the director's wishes. Many of the actors and actresses went off to have very successful careers. Charlie Sheen, Nick Cassavetes, Sherilyn Fenn, Randy Quaid, Matthew Berry, and of course, Clint Howard. Nick Cassavetes played Packard and went off to become a very successful director with such films as John Q and The Notebook. Steve Eckholt, George in the Beginning, has had a hugely successful TV career with shows like Friends and The West Wing. Matt Barry, who played Billy, has become one of Hollywood's top casting directors. This was Sherilyn Fenn's first leading role. She was dating Johnny Depp at the time, and the director wanted to get Depp cast as one of the gang, but the studio refused, saying he was a nobody. The awesome Clint Howard was Rughead. His hair was an homage to David Lynch's classic Eraserhead. In a tiny role was a then 16-year-old Brooke Burke, who would go on to become a very famous model. Charlie Sheen played Jake, and you all know Charlie Sheen. This was his second time as a lead. The first was The Boys Next Door the year earlier. Originally, Sheen was supposed to play both Jamie and Jake. However, because of his shooting schedule, Sheen had already left to film Platoon, and they used a double for some of the additional shots. I personally think this works better because imagine if the exact guy that was killed came back. It would have eliminated the whole mystery angle, and honestly, it would have been kinda silly. The gang would have immediately known that Jamie was the Wraith. The movie was dedicated to Bruce Ingram, who was one of the cameramen. During one of the chase sequences, the camera car was flipped and Bruce was thrown and killed. Writer-director Mike Marvin was inspired by the movie High Plains Drifter. He also studied Mad Max and The Road Warrior, which heavily influenced the look of the car chases. Marvin had a fight with the producers about everything. Lots of studio politics tried to screw up the film. The producers were constantly trying to push the director to film faster to get the movie done well under budget. They pushed so hard that one day he got a call sheet for 110 shots in a day. Unless you're Uwe Boll, you know that is ridiculous. The producers had little faith in the movie and just saw it as a way to turn a quick buck. They wouldn't even let the cast watch their own dailies. One of the producers even screwed up the theatrical run of the film. He found a place in Canada that would process the film prints much cheaper than the one in the US, so he ended up ordering reels through there, only to have the audio screwed up on all of them. Many people who saw in the theater complained about not hearing what the actors were saying, that everything was muffled and low. Rather than recall the film and remaster it like they should have done, the producer just left the bad audio and pocketed the money. Thankfully, the audio was fixed for the home video release, and the movie went on to become a huge cult hit. Marvin wrote 2 sequels for the film. The first was called Turbo Interceptor, which was actually the original name until they changed it to The Wraith. He was asked to sell the rights for a remake, but he's hoping to do the sequel. The director had a different soundtrack in mind, but one of the studio executives made a deal with a record studio and forced the music in there. While I normally side with the director, in this case it's tough because the soundtrack in this is freaking awesome. While I don't know for sure, the whole supernatural revenge aspect of the film is fairly similar to James O'Barr's The Crow. I'm not saying The Crow ripped it off, it didn't, but it does seem to at least have taken some inspiration from The Wraith. Beyond just the supernatural revenge aspect, a big standout is this. The Wraith had Skank and Gutter Boy, while The Crow had Skank and Fun Boy. Although Skank in the comic wasn't one of the killers, they switched it out so he was in the movie. This movie is fantastic. From the casting, to the action, to the outstanding car chases, there isn't a thing I don't like. I know some people didn't like that there was no explanation about how Jamie came back, but I was fine with that. Over-explaining things can only lead to disappointment. Another interesting thing about the movie is that it's filled with swears, violence, nudity, attempted rape, all this, and it's only rated PG-13. Much like how The Devil's Reign was only PG, this makes me remember a time when PG and PG-13 didn't mean completely watered-down garbage. A lot of work went into trying to make this a good film. It's a shame the producers made the whole thing such a chore. It goes to show how much care the director put into making the film, that in the end, even after all the studio interference, it's still a very entertaining movie.
Jesus, this shit's got some kick.